Before we go to the next witness, I wish to introduce the Apple Act. There are some slides there I would look at. In a prior life before I came here, I spent 16 years in the legislature, all on the Appropriations Committee for Public Education, trying to find money for education, and also 28 years in the classroom as a teacher, knowing that end of it. There always seemed to be something like a dam that was stopping the flow of funds going to the schools. It was a difficult one to do. I think one thing we found out is that schools have historically been based upon land as a funding mechanism. It goes back to Henry VIII when he established the Church of England, and he took the monasteries away from the Catholic Church. He gave them to aristocracy on the condition that they maintained the school systems that had been established by the church itself. 1777, Georgia became the first state to actually give efforts to help their schools in the counties. Ironically, half of the counties in Georgia rejected it because they said it was an insult to them, thinking they couldn't do their own jobs. Connecticut actually sold 3.3 million acres of land to put up a full trust fund for education. Of course, the land they sold was in Ohio, but at least they were selling something of land at the time. And Texas, as you'll note, has very little public land, but when they became a state, they set aside 17,000 acres for a permanent trust fund for their education systems. One of the things we notice right here is the land policy makes it difficult for those in the West to do the same thing. Everything that is red on that map is owned by the federal government. You will notice the federal government owns 1 out of every 3 acres, and primarily in the West. Those of us in the West have the wonderful opportunity of realizing the federal government owns 1 out of every 2 acres. And the BLM land, which is the basis of this particular bill, 93% of that is found west of Denver. If you notice the next map, you'll see the states in red are the states that have the slowest rate in their education growth. If you flip back between 2 and 3, Casey, just a minute. If you look at those maps, look at the federal land, go back to the states having problems, go back to the federal land, you will notice there is a unique correlation between the amount of federal lands and the difficulty states have in funding their education system. 11 of the 17 states that have the slowest growth rate are found in the West. That is also, not yet, don't get ahead of me here, that is also almost double the rate. 92% growth in the states east of Denver, only 56% growth in the states that are west of that. It is double in the east than it is in the west. Now the question you have to have is why? What is the paradox? Why do we in the West have the slowest growth in our education funding? Why do we in the West have the largest class sizes? The 12 states have the largest class size. 9 of them are found in the West on public land states. Why, as you see in here, do we have the kids? The growth rate of public education students is triple in the West than it is in the East. And still we have the kids, we have the overcrowded classrooms. We cannot fund our education system, not nearly to what our friends in the East are having with a lighter base. Now, why is that? Is it because we're not paying taxes, as you noticed in the next one? The West pays actually more taxes in state and local taxes as a percent of their income than those in the East do. Is it because, it's also not because we're not putting education into our state budgets. Once again, you'll find out Western states put more of their budget towards education than Eastern states do as a percentage. The reason why we're having is this particular one. The ones that are yellow don't have public lands. The highest, none of them have more than 15% of their land as in public, and the total average for the East is 4%. Those of us in the West get a great total of 52%, and you notice especially those in the red ones that are in the West, we have the abundant opportunity of having more than 52% of our land tied up by the federal government. It is interesting to note that when each of these Western states was admitted to the Union, in their Enabling Act, there was language that was put in there that said that that was not to be the way of things. Each of them had phrases in there that said 5% of the proceeds of the sale of public lands lying within said state, which shall be sold by the United States subsequent to the admission of said state into the Union, after deducting all the expenses incident the same, shall be paid to the said state to be used as a permanent fund, the interest of which only shall be expended for the support of common schools within said states. The only 2 states in the West that didn't get that language in their enabling acts are Hawaii, which got nothing because there's not a whole lot of land there that's owned by the federal government, and California. Wasn't in their enabling act. Instead, Congress passed a special piece of legislation a year after they were a state that gave them the same promise that those of us in the West were given. The obvious thing is that promise simply was never fulfilled. Oklahoma got that promise. When they were made a state, the government gave them a $5 million bonus to bring them in on an equal footing with those in the West, but the rest of us in the West simply didn't have it. The cost to us, if the federal government had fulfilled what they promised in the Enabling Act, is about a one-time expenditure of $14 billion that would go to those western states. If you taxed the land that they kept at the lowest rate, the absolute lowest property tax rate is if it's totally worthless land, it would be an extra $6 billion coming to those western states if the federal government just put those lands, or the federal government paid the tax, or if those lands were on the tax rolls. Now, some people say we're solving that problem with PILT. PILT is supposed to help states with that, but as you'll see in here, PILT has never been more than 4% of what could be raised if those lands were actually taxed like normal pieces of property. And PILT money does not go to schools. That goes to counties, which means, as you'll see in here, what's happening to the West, those are what the West is losing every year in lost property tax revenue because the federal government did not live up to the language in the enabling acts that were promised to statehood. When it comes to education, once again, at the lowest rate possible, that's how much each state would be gaining from those lands if they were allowed to be taxed every year. It's very simple. Education is based on property tax. We lose $4 billion a year in the West because these lands do not generate property tax for us. And PILT doesn't come close to cutting it, nor does SRS come close to cutting it. We lose $2 billion in loss of severance and royalty taxes that states could be getting if they actually had control of these lands, plus the income tax that would be given from high-paying jobs if we could actually develop our own lands, as well as the school trust lands we each have that are surrounded by public lands and sometimes make them inaccessible and unusable to generate revenue as they were supposed to be generated. So the solution to this one is simply APPLE, which is cute for the Action Plan for Public Lands and Education. Senator Urquhart, thank your wife for coming up with that name. It's a wonderful name. What this does is simply say, okay, the states were promised 5% of the proceeds from the sale of that land. Let the states pick 5% of their land to be used for a permanent fund to pay for their education. It can only go to the trust fund with their education. I should put a caveat in here. I said every western state was promised 5% for education. 3 states, Colorado, Nevada, and Oregon, were actually promised 5% for infrastructure, but you can use it for education if you want to in my bill. Excluded from the land they can choose are wilderness areas, national parks, military installations, Native American property, historic sites, and wildlife refuges. First of all, because I don't want to create the dilemma that some people have said might exist. But more importantly, states don't want those lands because they don't generate money. Those are money losers. And they're not going to pick those. They need lands that can actually generate something for their states. 9 states have already passed resolutions in support of this, which I could say this was my idea. It actually came from the Council of State Governments West. So it was a think tank proper. It was an effort of legislators sitting down, thinking of how to help themselves in the future as best they possibly can. The bottom line is here. In the West, kids are harmed. And they're harmed by the land policy the federal government imposes on the West. It was not intended to be that way. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it ought not to be that way. And it's about time we realize kids should not be harmed simply because they live in the West with the absentee landowner of the federal government. With that, I would like to